Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Particle Accelerator Podcast, where we talk to future thinking business leaders about how to accelerate their team and grow their business. I'm here today with Gary. Gary, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, how you doing? Gary Aucoin in the great state of Texas, down in the Houston area. Mostly working around oil and gas the last 15, 20 years. Currently working in the area of health, safety, and environmental with some focus on security, sustainability, crisis management, and risk management.
Yeah, I think when everybody hears oil and gas now, because we all tend to binge watch the same shows, they're thinking landman. How would you dispel the link there? Are you running around checking a bunch of wells, or give people a little bit of an idea what your daily life is like?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that. I think the folks in oil and gas watch Landman and shake their head a little bit. It's really not that exciting. I guess that's like asking a cowboy to watch Yellowstone. So it's about what you could compare it to, or even asking a doctor how close Grey's Anatomy is to the hospital scene.
Right, of course.
Technology today has really allowed us to stay off of the wells, so we don't have to frequent as much. And the technology is really good enough to where we know something's wrong. Not to mention there's cameras, but any kind of upset in the system where you have a well that's flowing at a certain percentage, it's very much calculated. And just the smallest blurps can really allow somebody to see it remotely, or there's some level of exemption reports that are created around certain parameters. In the onshore world, the shale world, a little bit more predictable, easy to get to. However, offshore, much different story. And you have the wellhead at the bottom of on the seabed, and you've got different type of challenges, of course, to get out there.
Cool. I'm excited to talk to you about that. My grandfather was an oil and gas guy, so I'm excited to talk about this with you. I'd love to get to know you a little better. What was your first job? Like, how'd you make your first dollar? For me, it was a paper route. How, as a human, did you make your first buck?
I went around and chased down vacant houses from real estate and found the real estate agent or the bank that owned that house and offered to cut the grass for $30. And that was back in the mid 80s. And that was my first real hustle.
What a great target, because then you find the realtor or the property management company that owns that, and then they start calling you up for more. So how successful was that business?
That was good. That kept me busy. I was probably 13 or 14 years old, so I couldn't have a job legally in the great state of Louisiana where I grew up. So when I was able to finally get a job, I moved into the grocery business after school was over in the afternoon. It was a good run during the summer months for sure.
What toy or hobby did you have as a child that inspired what you do career-wise today?
I've always been fascinated by boats. Just loved being out on the water. Pushed me to joining the Coast Guard out of high school. And there I learned the love of auditing and compliance. There's elements of law enforcement, but just seeing good process and good things happening pushed me into security and investigations, which then morphed into the safety world. That's where I've been sitting for the last 20 years or so. I've been able to use those same skill sets throughout my Coast Guard career that I've picked up through retail security, through turn into a safety leader, and then identifying everything from simple mistakes, compliance, things that we can do better, picking up on process. Why is it like this? Why do we do this? The guy on the well site asking questions, and then further developing leadership skills to move up and ask more questions to more people, and then gaining the trust of the leaders that I worked for to later put me in those positions and get me the support I needed to move into leadership roles.
Yeah. What was your favorite and least favorite course in school?
I have to say that my most favorite course was constitutional law. I learned a lot. I had a very challenging instructor. She was the only one that would teach that class to make sure that everybody had to go through her at some point. I knew very early I needed to make friends with her. She was a previous judge and very neat character, but I really enjoyed her class. I learned a lot. She really brought the challenge for an undergraduate program. In my least favorite program, I had an idea that I would sit through visual arts in an 8 a.m. class. That was pretty tough because the instructor would turn the lights down so we could see the slides. And then you would just sit there and make notes and later try to memorize things that there was no chance I could remember. I would say that was probably one of my least favorite classes.
The ones that require toothpicks are a little bit rough. What quote from a famous person lives in your mind rent-free?
That's a good one. I have to say, not a famous person, but I'm sure he got it from somewhere. One of my very first mentors, who I still keep in touch with, he's been long retired. But he said the biggest problem he sees with leaders is their inability to make a decision. What he always told me was make a right decision or make a wrong decision, but just make a decision so that people are not waiting on you. And ever since then, it's burned into my brain that we have to make some type of decision, start moving forward, and make sure that we're having good discussions, communicating, and heading in the right direction. And you can always course correct. Kind of goes right back into the old ISO standards of plan, do, check, act, right? So get it started, get everybody moving. You don't want people sitting around, and then people are going to have ideas, foster a good culture, make your change.
Love it. I'm going to get into some of this main round stuff here. What tech trends significantly impacted your industry, and how did your company respond?
We see a lot of technology that does replace people being so close to the bit, or back in the day, oil and gas, as you said, on land, man, you can see them throwing chains. Of course, we're not doing that, especially in the offshore world, have not done that in many years. In the onshore world, risk assessed, having people very close to the bit or close to the danger zone. With the alarms that we have today, with the technology, with the machinery, how that interacts with man has come a long way. And so now we can put a machine in the way instead of a hand. And that makes a huge difference. Unfortunately, we still have accidents out there, or incidents, if you will. The word accident means that you believe that it could happen, where an incident, we always say as a safety professional, we think that all incidents are preventable. We didn't do everything we needed to do. We didn't plan it properly. How man, technology, and machinery all come together and align has really moved the needle, preventing workplace incidents. However, we still have people that push beyond what that machinery can do. We still have people that get behind on projects and start cutting corners. This is where the human behavior factor really starts to come in play.
Yeah, that's cool. My grandfather owned a bunch of oil leases in the Permian Basin. So he definitely saw a couple of roughnecks with no fingers, or at least a finger missing. And so I'd go hunt rabbits while he was making sure the drill team did what they were supposed to do. So he watched a crews on his land get everything ready. So I grew up around the pump jack and rolling up a measure. I can imagine what he would say today, just knowing that he didn't have to go measure. He gets his water tank measurement and his well measurement directly to the office remotely. He'd be overjoyed not to have to run out there.
Just think if he knew that there would be an app on his cell phone that could log in real time and not only give him the information he wanted, but could break it down and tell him what percentage of plus or minus and when the next truck was coming and all those things. Pretty amazing how far we've come.
Yeah, I think the only thing he'd be disappointed about that is then he wouldn't know when to do his Budweiser drinking, and it would reduce the number of Marlboro Reds he could smoke, because on his way home, he'd be 2 beers in before he even landed. Just your old school redneck.
I love it, man. Those guys never retired either. They just kept doing it.
Yeah, for sure.
Amazing.
What other technology innovations are you betting drive your business growth?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. We see a lot of sharing of information, how information's shared, where we have challenges. We have more ability to communicate across. In the world of safety, we have a lot of means of collecting data, and that data all leads into better equipment. We can see when we have equipment failures, how we communicate with each other. And it is about educating supervisors. I know that on your show, you probably talk a lot about more technology and innovative stuff. When it comes down to human behavior, we understand it a little bit more in the last 20 years. For a while there, it was this guy doesn't know what he's doing. He's only been out here 5 years and he still doesn't get it. We need to run him off. Versus asking more questions around what led you to make this decision? How did this one incident create such a catastrophic consequence? Those type of things really go a long way today in this business. And when you start asking questions like that, now you're understanding the heart and the mind of the individual in the decision-making process. And so there's things in there that allow us as safety professionals or as frontline supervisors to ask certain questions every day to their people to make sure that they're switched on and ready to work, because either way, somebody has to hit the power button.
In my environment, IT went from this ITIL process, this change management process that was really about tracking your work and making sure it's changed properly, to more of an automation. And so they started calling that DevOps, right? This idea of writing code that would create the infrastructure pull your run books and your SEs into some code that could then be reran and done so accurately. And so those guys would also, as they're writing that code and managing the infrastructure, they got pulled into the IT stuff. One of my favorite authors is Sidney Decker. He wrote a book called Just Cause and did a bunch of work around incidents like what you're talking about. I don't know if he coined it or if it just came out of this DevOps movement, but this idea of a blameless postmortem.
Yep.
The idea that in the medical profession, there would be something that could save you next to something that could kill you. The nurse grabs the wrong thing and she administers it in the ER. And then all of a sudden she's hung out to dry, like her career's over. There might even be civil action, legal action against her. All she says is the two things were there. I grabbed the wrong one. Eventually, smart people like Sidney Decker started saying, why were those two things next to each other? Isn't there some culpability that the environment has for allowing there to be this idea of an incident or an accident? And then you'd even have the postmortem discussion and say, okay, a patient died. What went wrong? The nurse is saying, I grabbed the wrong medication. If we just blamed the person, we would learn nothing. People functioned perfectly, then no mistakes would happen and we wouldn't learn how to improve the system. And sounds like in oil and gas, there's been some of that, or at least in the safety industry that you're in, there's been some of that. Okay, yeah, sure. That person did the wrong thing in that environment, but we also need to think about why did we put them in that place to make that mistake?
When we talk about human and organizational performance, and when we say, I was on a site in another country last couple of months, and basically we identify where somebody was on a cell phone walking underneath a lift, and we clearly have a no cell phone program out there. Clearly we don't walk underneath lifts. These are, critical mistakes. The team pulls his badge. I'm the director of HSC. They really wanted to show a hard stance and said, don't worry, he'll be fired. We're going to escort him off the property. And I said, well, what do we learn from that if we just fire him? They came back and said, we'll have him tell the guys he was fired because he did this and this. Would it be more powerful if we had him tell them? Ultimately, we talked to the supervisor and the guy comes rushing over to us and says, this is my best guy. I cannot lose him. But clearly what we observed, there's no way he could be his best guy. He might have been his best worker, but he wasn't the best guy to be the leader, to be the supervisor, and to certainly set the example for the rest of the guys. But he was the guy that could get it done. Well, he got it done because he was cutting corners and not paying attention to some of the rules. At the end of the day, when you talk about this blameless culture, you have to look at the system itself. And also within this human and organizational performance, there's 5 steps to the whole thing. The other part is, what do you do with the learning? And also the fact that context drives everything. So what was he thinking? Why did he have to take that call? Why does he have to have a cell phone? The forklift operator, why didn't he stop when the guy walked underneath the load? So it was a whole cultural thing within that area that, yeah, you could look at it and just fire that guy, but the next guy coming in is going to use his cell phone within the next 3 days and do the same thing, but we might not have that same result. And so that's the part that we learn from.
Yeah. No, I love that. And what we learned is that most outages or most incidents were really a combination of factors. That if we didn't assume malicious intent and figured out what was the intent, we could actually come up with, okay, this was really a combination of signals that just led to this unfortunate event that lead to the outage. So what can we learn and how can we best prevent that from future occurrence? Of course, we want to avoid those outages and failure. So we're inspired to do that. What would you say are some gaps between your ambitions, like where you'd like to see your industry go, and the realities of today? What are you anticipating that would seal the deal for you?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times we have our leadership teams focused on certain goals, and then the safety teams or the HSC group has their goals as well. And the issue is that both those goals should be written together. When you look at leadership goals, they shouldn't be any different than the folks around them, the support functions. If you have operations, you have to have a strong supporting cast. Nobody works for the safety guy. They don't work for our department. They work for their boss in operations. And so many times I think the HSC folks are driving certain elements or prioritizing things that are important that the business doesn't necessarily look at as an important driver. And so I think it's important for HSE leadership to make those connections for operations as to why these objectives should be prioritized. And when you look at that, now things like compliance may not be so simple. We might have to rewrite how we're doing things. It could create a delay. It could cost money. But these are the things that you try to prevent ahead of time when you're doing these risk assessments so that you can demonstrate or show. And then it's a lot of persuasion or influence. I've even had somebody call me a manipulator last year, the way that we were trying to influence some folks to take over some tasks that were really important. And the individual looked at me and said, "Man, you're just a manipulator." And I said, "I don't know what the difference between manipulation and influence is, but I know we get to the same result. And so how can we educate folks to buy into these priorities? If they don't feel like it's a priority, how do we escalate it to where people understand that this is the risk that we're going to take on if we don't do these things?"
So we always see that with internet security. So just, hey, we need these features, these new capabilities. That's what's going to drive revenue. And the security team is always, hey, yeah, these are some things. Let's order a pen test, a few things, and make sure we're not getting too far off the rails. What about our SOC compliance or ISO certification? People treat it like a whisper. It never becomes a priority until the security incident. The security budget is always justified in retrospect.
Absolutely.
Fortunate. But once the incident happens, we're like, yeah, we should have done those things. It suddenly justifies the increase in spend. I'm sure you're seeing that too. Hey, we're reminding you, we're trying to put you in the best possible place, but we weren't the priority. Now there's been an incident and now all of a sudden get our moment in the sun.
Sometimes our moment in the sun is the middle of the desert with no shade, right? Sometimes we didn't speak loud enough to be proactively and not fully selling the risks or what the consequence would be, or the consequences unforeseen, which means we didn't do the proper risk assessment. But I've seen it where we've made some tough choices and the companies have accepted some of these risks ahead of time. Murphy's Law happens. We wind up going into knee-jerk mode because it gets 3 or 4 levels up from where those decisions are. People start asking more questions, and the teams that are really on the ground are really starting to get pushed. And then we wind up spending 3, 4, 5 times the amount of money that we would have spent just to recover. Statistically, they say in our business, if you think safety is expensive, try having an incident. Studies have shown that incidents cost 4 times the amount of money that you can put on paper. We look at retraining, lawyers, workers' comp, and other things, the real tangible stuff that we can add into it, the damage to the vehicle. But then what's the price to pay to the insurance and then all these other things? At the end of the day, what we always see is this increased budget. We see an increased focus in those areas. And then we think we get that little area where it needs to be. And then those budgets start falling again. We don't pay attention. We know that it can happen. It has happened. And we stop paying attention and start pulling off some of those resources or OpEx or CapEx that we were putting on it as soon as it happened. And then it's that cycle.
But I like the extreme ownership you had there with how you said, it's my job to be understood. I think that's a great mindset that you have. We need to be louder about the risk justification. That's a solid mindset. What do you think the biggest challenge is for maintaining a competitive edge in your industry?
Companies have learned the hard way when you have major safety incidents. 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico was infamous to an oil company that is having a hard time escaping that. Basically, in this industry, your reputation is your license to operate. It affects everything you do, how people show up for work for you, how people interact with you, how investors look at you, how the regulatory agencies look at you. All those things come into play. One example I always like to give, I worked on the contractor side for a service company. The guys would talk about the companies that we were going to go work for that day or what we had coming up. And so they said, hey, we're going to go to XYZ site this week. Company man's good guys. So they would kind of show up, their pants untucked, not as crisp. The cars weren't washed. They might slip in a couple of extra new guys there. They didn't really follow the policy or the procedure like you should have. But there was other work that was really coveted, and they were trying to get in with other operators. So They would say, oh, this week we're going to go work for so-and-so. Their shirts were pressed. They had the procedures printed out. All the paperwork was super crisp. They showed up 15 minutes early. They enforced all the safety meetings. They participated. They raised their hands. Whereas the accountability from the smaller companies that didn't have to voice those same expectations didn't get that level of respect. And so I think from an accountability standpoint, it does come down communicating what those expectations are and how you apply those expectations and the interactions that you're having ahead of that work coming up. And we worked with one company on a 7-day project in the Gulf of Mexico. We were lifting something from another vessel and lowering it to the seabed, and they were going to flange it up with some ROV. This company was in our office twice a week with meetings. We did 5 or 6 run-throughs, and the project went perfect. And then there was other companies that we worked for 3 to 4 months with 2 vessels in tandem, working side by side underneath an oil platform. And we definitely had a lot of meetings, but nothing to the scope that we had of this other one. It's how you set up that level of accountability and those expectations. And I think people respond to that.
Yeah, it's that operational excellence is that determining factor. What advice can you share for connecting technology roadmaps with overall business strategy? A lot of my listeners are business leaders, and so they're looking for any productivity tip or way of planning. Do you guys use any particular strategy for planning or driving accountability within your org?
Yeah, we have a program where we like to state the objective at the beginning of meetings. That way everybody knew why we were having a meeting. You hear about all these CEOs and other strategies around meetings. Some CEOs believe that every meeting's an hour. The first half hour, everybody reads the pre-read, and second half hour, you go through what you just read for a decision-making process. I think the first thing you have to do is identify who needs to be in the meeting, what the purpose of that meeting is, and then the objective for why everybody's there. I think once people expect that, then you get down to why are we here? What are we doing? What is the expectation for me in this meeting? It goes back to levels of organizational accountability or personal accountability. The next steps are, what is the risk for the decision we're making? Either an upside risk or a downside risk. What is the expected outcome? And can we get there? Who's pushing for this outcome? A lot of times we have different initiatives, but nobody's asking for those initiatives. Nobody's relating the outcome of that initiative to an improvement process. It may be something that a leader or a manager wants to adopt because they did it before or heard it on a podcast, right? So you have to really make those connections for folks. That's really how I try to plan the business. I want people to know and be aware of what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Like goal-driven versus task-driven. We do strategic planning around a 1-page plan and then 90-day milestones. And everybody's targeting those 90-day milestones. But we're even like, what's your one thing for this week? What's the one thing that you have to get done this week that's going to help you fulfill your quarterly objectives? And then how does that tie to our overall annual goals? That drives the objectives that people are really hunting for.
I love that statement. One thing that I saw was I really wanted to push my teams to the field more last year. We had a lot of people sitting in the office. I didn't see the value. I think the risk is in the field. And if our folks in the office can't contribute to what's going on in the field because they don't know the risks, then I don't need that many people in the office, right? We want to be the support function for the field. When we sat down to do our performance review, the individual forgot they were supposed to be in the field X amount of times last year. And I said, I invited you to the field. We gave you exposure here. We asked here, and all I got back was all the times you asked me, I just couldn't go. So we really got into this victim mentality. There's an amazing book called The Oz Principle that I've done with my teams for years. It's probably about 25 years old, but still one of the best books on organizational and individual accountability. We introduced that book and we didn't hear all those excuses. It was, I am not going to be a victim. I'm going to be above the line. And just to push that book a little bit.
We definitely have core teaching about victim versus creator. Until you take responsibility, you can't create anything. You aren't going to be able to create any new possibility because you're essentially holding on to the current situation. The victim really leads to being stuck. And what I find is that once I pull that card, I can't take it out of the box. Like, we're going to have a discussion about whether you're taking responsibility or not. You just can't have that conversation and not see it all the way through. So I'm careful when I pull that card. I want to have my ammunition loaded because it's needed to have that conversation. Here's how you're showing up in that way. But once people realize that if they take responsibility, they can create new outcomes, it's really powerful.
But no doubt about it. And people talk about being developed, right? I want to be developed. I want to do this. I want to do this. Boss, develop me. And I say to people, I don't know that people always recognize what development is. And I use this analogy. We had a new hire right out of college. And for about 6 to 9 months, the individual was saying, man, you got me doing this, and you got me doing this, and I'm doing this over here. And I really don't know how it all comes together. And I reminded him of the movie The Karate Kid, where Ralph Macchio's out there waxing on and waxing off and doing all these chores around the house, but within certain forms. He quickly reminds him of how it all comes together. And so that's what we did. But what we've seen in some of these early career graduates, we're working directly with them to make that connection for them, what the purpose is. Whereas I think for me, I was just excited to have a job and wanted to connect those things for myself. So I think it's a difference of generation. But now we see this particular individual, others around us that we've had in this program, really earning it now because they understand it.
What lessons have you learned from an initiative that failed to deliver expected value?
I talked a little bit about human and organizational performance, and there's a slide in there that talks about how we focus 99.9% of our time on the things that fail, and we try to figure out what was broke versus some of this lean methodology back in the day where we focused on what went right. So what we tried to do here recently was go back through and pick a couple of processes to see what we could improve in, whether it failed or not. We didn't really focus so much on the outcome, but you asked specifically about a failure. And when we go back and look at a lot of these failures, we identify that either the process is too complex or that situations have changed or the scenario has changed and those processes no longer work and they should not be used, or our workforce wasn't trained and they didn't really understand what they were doing in the first place. And so those were some of the common root causes that we see in there. And then we see a lot of contributory to their underlying causes that really come around. We didn't have the culture to ask. It comes back to some level of human behavior where we didn't have a good stop work culture or an open door policy to ask questions. We see a misalignment or a misfit there. I've been working in Matville for quite a few years, and you have some places that they're scared to ask a question or they're going to get run off of a job or a job site. And when you flip that and start inviting people to speak or say things or say what they see or take more ownership to fix things, then we see a much more productive workforce.
That's really cool. What kind of advice would you give to somebody who's starting their career journey or starting to get started in your industry?
I would say from an oil and gas perspective, anything to do within that line of work, it's tough starting out and putting in your time, getting the bruises, not running away or shying away from the work really provides a lot of dividends later on. I would say we see a lot of people. I grew up with a lot of people that joined the industry, made a lot of money very quickly and said, I don't need to go to school. That is really a fallacy. Companies still look at the level of education tied into time, experience in the field and accomplishments. I think all those things are still very relevant in this industry. People, for some reason, feel like the kids that are coming out of college these days, they have these new ways of doing things. They can do this and they can do that. And I don't know if all that's true. I think that they can do it on a computer, but I'm not sure they can do it hands-on. And so it's a different type of leadership mentality that has to happen in how you lead the newer workforce. But for the most part, I'm not shying away from education and really trying to find your niche, see what you love to do and do it. I always say I haven't worked a day in 25 years. I've been pretty fortunate for that.
That's cool. If people like what you've had to share, how would you like them to connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, Gary Aucoin, Aucoin on LinkedIn.
Awesome. I'll make sure to get that in the show notes. Really appreciate you being here with us. Thanks for your insights and letting us know about the industry you're in.
Absolutely. I enjoyed the conversation. Thanks a lot.